Good evening and good morning, everybody, and very welcome to this masterclass, which is dealing with a very important topic. I just want to check before we say anything further. Can you hear me properly? Is there just a heads up? Yeah, there's all good. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you and have so many people together in this forum, in this very extraordinary circumstances that we are living in at the moment with the pandemic. It's great to be gathered together in a large group, but on the Zoom platform where everybody is very safe. Very good to be with you. The topic of the day is addictions, and I'm going to talk about the neuroscience of addiction in this masterclass. So my name is Etienne van der Walt, neurologist and CEO of Neurozone. Very happy to be with you. Most of you who are on this call are already Neurozone certified coaches or human capital professionals. Great to have you here. And for those of you who are newcomers joining us today, you are also very, very welcome. We have an hour to discuss this incredibly important topic. And maybe just another little bit of laying the land, if you may, is this idea that as we are, I would assume, almost everywhere in the world now, very much isolating ourselves in more confined spaces in our homes, working from home, spending so much time very often self-isolated, as I said before, the whole, if you may, concept of addiction is something which we should not throw out of our consciousness when we think about all the consequences of this viral pandemic. There are so many things that come into play now, and you as coaches working with your clients, also online, I'm sure mostly, think about this as well, that as we are more and more secluded, working on our own, potentially feeling more lonely, a little bit to significantly more disconnected, this is a grave risk for those who have the tendency for addictions and who have been addicted, being in remission for a long time. Very challenging time. So these are just a few opening remarks. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to really go into the brain, this world of addiction and the neuroscience of addiction. And I thought what I'm going to do today is to really spend a bit of time with you going through how the brain works again for us to perform at our best, how goal-directedness works, how the brain assigns energy to tasks and the energy that is available. Remember that we said energy is finite, but that doesn't mean that you assign all that finite energy or the right and appropriate finite energy to tasks to achieve goals. We need to be able to actually assign that energy, and this is where goal-directed behavior comes in. And goal-directed behavior very, very dependent on a non-addictive brain. And so I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking with you again, a little bit revisionary on the brain and its workings for performance. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time to try to explain a few quite difficult concepts. But it is so crucial to understand addiction. And I think there are a few wow moments here when we get to that point. So bear with me. I'm going to go a little bit into some molecular neurobiology, if I may, with you. And I'll try to take it very slowly because, you know, I haven't been in a biology laboratory and even dealing with this kind of neuroscience for a long time. So I think we all need to go very slow and actually try to make sense of this concept, the neuroscience of addiction. And of course, I'm going to use my old help, which is the slides. And so let me just share screen with you and see if we can get to the slides. Please let me know if you don't see the slides. Here we go. We start in the top. And just before I'm going to talk about addiction and definition, just to allude you to this particular infographic, which was developed by our research and development department. This was in LinkedIn and was shared on the Neurozone LinkedIn page. And I hope that you've come across this a little bit, of course, quite a bit of information there, but it's very useful to read through that as well. So if you want to take time, have a look at Neuroscience Inside Substance Dependence and Addiction, go to the Neurozone LinkedIn page and you will find it there. So one way of describing addiction that I really find very, very valuable is this idea, which has been published by the American Psychiatric Association in one of their recent journals. It says it is a brain disease that is manifested by compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences. Now, you see the use, it doesn't say abuse, because compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences constitute abuse, right? And so what is even more important, even before you get there, is this idea that it is a brain disease. So addiction is a brain disease, and it's important to for a moment think about this. This is not only just a psychological phenomenon. It is not only just something that you can, through with all kinds of different kind of behavioral, cognitive behavioral therapy and a number of other, if you may, interventions from a psychological perspective can correct. An addiction, when it is well ingrained, is a very physical condition. It is a condition that has altered the structures of the brain. And I'm going to go through that to demonstrate to you how this works. And once we understand this deeply, it becomes quite profoundly important to understand how to support people with addictions. Initially, of course, as a brain disease and a very much a disorder that requires treatment by medical professionals or healthcare professionals in a typical healthcare setting. And then, of course, as you then start to get to the point where there's some physical corrections and improvements, this is where the layer of psychological and psychiatrical behavioral treatments come into play, and of course coaching down the line as you integrate an individual back into this world of functionality and then high performance. So it's a very long road, different steps, because it is so deeply ingrained. I think that is the first important point to make. Addictions is not something that can be coached into a highly functional state unless you have caught that problem at a point where this is still possible. And very often addicts, people with an addiction, will of course typically deny that they have the addiction. It's a very, very typical thing to do, and it's extremely common for people with an addiction to deny the addiction simply because they don't have the courage and this goal-directed behavior to have the courage to take control of their own situation and to hand it over to somebody else to actually help them. And so the helplessness leads to a form of denial. I'm not going to go into the psychology of this simply because I'm not a psychologist. And so let me stick to what I'm good at. Maybe I can just first of all talk about the idea of the addiction, just a few little interesting and very alarming numbers in the US. This was in 2017, 19.7 million people aged 12 years and older having an alcohol or illicit drug addiction. And so massive amount, and there you can see the tobacco, 48.7 million, and the annual cost for these addictions exceeds $700 billion in 2017. This is for healthcare, economic costs, and rehabilitation care of, and of course also the costs to criminal offenses and the kind of misconduct and behavior that is associated with addictions. So a massive problem. I don't have the numbers for 2020 or 2019, but I think this helps us to understand the grave size of this problem. I want to just show, almost as always with a masterclass, I want to show you a really just maybe just point you direct your attention to this particular article in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, a very well-known and a well-respected academic journal. The Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. You can see there the neurobiology of addiction. I find this a very, very valuable review, but be warned, you definitely have to understand something about the more molecular components of neuroscience and the neural circuitry that goes with that. But what I will tell you is all the certified coaches, you've been through a course that helps you to understand a number of these structures that we refer to. So you might be able to actually connect the dots. And so give it a go, have a look at it. But I'm also going to talk you through a number of these concepts that are now well known in the neuroscientific fraternity. It all starts, as once again, always, the brain's deep internal structures. This is where things go wrong and also go right. This is where high performance starts, where resilience is built, and where addictions is developed. It happens in the neural circuitry. It happens in the synapses, the connections between these brain cells. And as you can see here, the neurons, the blue cells that are connected with those yellow cells, the so-called oligodendrocytes, providing the myelin that insulate these wires, the axons, as for better conduction. And this is where you see the circuits are the ones that are affected and respond to addictions, if you may, in a certain way that leads to certain habituation and develop into this kind of addictive behavior, as opposed to goal-directed behavior, which is goal-directed towards appropriate stimuli of threat and reward in our immediate environment. Very important to actually note that goal-directedness in its essence is being affected by addictions, simply because it already says that, right? Because addictions is an habituation, is a certain kind of goal-directed behavior, which is goal-directed towards satisfying the addiction. And so this is not the only reason addictions are so bad for goal-directed behavior and for performance and for resilience in general. It is also very much deeper than that. But at least it's already easy to understand that when you think of goal-directedness as one of the three major emotional drivers of the brain's working, problem-solving, decision-making, and resilient, high-performing machine, then one can already understand things are really going deeply wrong if you are not goal-directed towards appropriated response to threats and rewards in front of us. Right, and so compulsive behavior, for example, forms part of this problem, and once again, all part of a non-goal directed type of behavior. And I'm going to try to show you where all these things go wrong as they start to develop, right from the point of substance use to the point of eventual addiction. So if you go to the addiction, then there are three major phases, and I think you all are very familiar with this idea. The first one is binging or intoxication. That's quite easy to understand. I use the substance and I either abuse it or overuse it, for example, in binging, or I just intoxicate myself with this particular substance. This could also, of course, be, doesn't only have to be drugs. It could also be I'm intoxicated by the continuous stimulus of, for example, gambling, or the continuous stimulus of sexual images in sexual addiction. So these are all part of the same concept and construct, if you may. It's an intoxication or a binging process. I need the stimulus, and so the stimulus could be a substance that I take in, or it could be other forms of sensory intake of what eventually gives me this reward response and overstimulate the reward response in the brain. So the next one then is once my system is cleared from what I've been exposed to, in time I develop this withdrawal response, but also in over longer periods of time, I can develop more what is called a stress response. It's called the dark side of addiction. So I can develop the dark side of addiction that actually plunges me deeper and deeper into this pit, which becomes a very physical dysfunction. And I'll get to that in a second. but the idea of stress and reward is being affected after this binge and intoxication is a second phase. And then later, I become preoccupied by the idea of needing the stimulus again, being directed towards the stimulus, and anticipating the potential reward that comes from this particular stimulus. And then this continues to repeat itself. And I'm just showing you this unfortunate, quite unclear, you wouldn't be able to see this very clearly, but I couldn't find a better one. And I just want to show you, this actually comes from this article that I recommended to you. You can see it starts there. It is binge intoxication. There is negative effect and withdrawal. So this is the stress effect, the dark side. And then there's preoccupation and anticipation, and it continues to drive itself. I'm going to talk to the brain substances just now that are actually, or the brain structures that are affected. So the whole synaptic system, and remember we started out, this must be a very well-known little image to you, which is always the synapse. This is the connection between two cells, and you see those little yellow structures there are receptors. They receive substances that are secreted here. And in the case of addictions, these substances that are secreted are dopamine. There are other substances as well. It's a very complex system process, but I'm going to speak quite a bit to dopamine as the reward neurotransmitter. Remember that serotonin gives me the sense that, yes, I'm okay. Dopamine, yes, I've achieved it. I've achieved my goal. I'm rewarded by this action, by my tasks that have been achieved. So I gain motivation and confidence from a task that is a positive, constructive task that leads to constructive results, including a sense of belonging. Doesn't make sense, a sense of making a meaningful contribution, social safety, and all of that coming into play. And you can actually see how all of that then works together for reward. I've just heard something here. Am I still online? Can I just check? Somebody just said that I am online. I've got a chat there. Let me see. Yes, all good. Thank you. Wonderful. I was very afraid to actually lose this moment. It's fascinating stuff we are dealing with now. So this idea is that the synaptic system is all about dopamine secreted in a very specific part of the brain in result to the substance that I would now use. And of course, in time, there is something that changes. And so these circuits change, and these substances, these structures change. So you have a change in the receptors here. If you continuously feed it with the stuff that you're actually now using, if I say the you, you know what I mean. This is changes and the circuits changes. And so this is called neuroadaptation, adaptation of the neural circuits. The system starts to physically change, and then the circuits physically adapts as well. And this is what you've got to think about. All right, so let me go to the next. I think what we're going to do now is actually going to journey a little bit through the brain. Just before I get there, yes, just to show you, these are actually neurons that are connected in an interesting way, explaining through different neurotransmitters that they secrete. So this little neuron here, you can see, secretes dopamine, DA. This one here secretes GABA. That's called, that's the inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, of which we have many, GABA. And then there's opioid peptides. So this refers to, for example, where the morphines work in endorphins. But you can see that nicotine plays a role here. There you see alcohol, its effect, question of whether it actually affects the GABA there. Opiates there, and also nicotine and alcohol on the opioid. So these are opiates and the opioid types of peptides, and opiates actually work in this area as well in this circuit. So you can actually see that all these substances, these are the substances, right? They work in specific places. Why am I actually putting up this particular slide? I want to share this thought with you for a moment, and it's actually makes so much sense. You cannot have an addiction for a substance, for example, unless that substance does something for a specific part of your brain that your brain makes its own substances for. And so what we are doing is we are basically over stimulating particular parts of our brain that is dependent on endogenous substances that do good for us. An example is, let's use the example of opiates. If you use opiates, for example, morphine, we actually make our own endorphins, the endogenous morphine called endorphins. We make our own cannabis, endocannabinoids. I'm sure you've heard of those. And so we actually produce our own internal substances that are actually used for our benefit in the right amounts when we do the right things. Makes sense, right? Exercise. 20 minutes into exercise, you work through the pain threshold. What do you secrete? You secrete endorphins. You secrete endocannabinoids, cannabis and morphine. Remember from those videos in the course. And you actually start to make your own drugs, if you may, but in the right amounts to do good for the system and to ensure that it's nourished properly, because everything affects everything. And in that sense, it starts to ensure that the whole brain is well structured and ready to respond to external incoming cues in the right way, to actually interpret threats and rewards sensibly, and then have the right response, an appropriate response to that, assign the right energy through good self-leadership to actually overcome the challenges that is in front of us. But now I'm actually starting to abuse these substances. And of course, there are similarities, and we're not going to go into everything because we don't have time for that. When it comes to, for example, sex addiction, when it comes to gambling, that you're more, if you may, not substance-based, but as we said, incoming cues and certain stimulus in the same areas lead to the same kind of destruction when it becomes an addictive process. Okay, so this is actually very useful to understand that we are actually just abusing, or actually it's a maladaptive use of what is really good for us. And now I'm going to journey through the brain a bit with you. So bear with me for a second. Let's just for a moment just revise a few structures. It's important because I'm going to talk about those structures. So I took some snapshots from the 3D model that is also in the course, just to remind you of a few structures in the brain. So this brain is sort of looking at us from the side, a little bit tilted upwards, and this person is sort of showing us its right there, the right frontal lobe. So you see the right frontal lobe there, the left frontal lobe is just behind it there, and then the rest of the brain behind, and the brain stem. And of course you can see there's the pituitary gland. You see that yellow pear-shaped punch bag, and then you see the hypothalamus. By the way, just for interest sake, these little structures here are the so-called as the olfactory nerves with the olfactory bulb. This is for smell. Amazing how much information, how much of the circuitry of the brain and of the limbic system is dedicated to smell. We should actually talk about this at some point, but let me just leave it there now for the lack of time. What you see in the frontal lobe is, you see this blob here, area there, the orange area, is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I get these strange sounds, and I just want to have to check again if you can still hear me, or just let me know if you can't. Excellent. All good. And so what you see here, these little almost turquoise areas, they are, let me just go back one slide. Excellent. Excellent. Let me just go back one slide. So now you see this turquoise, if you may, colored area is the lower medial, in the middle, lower medial part of the frontal lobe, and this is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This is also part of the brain which sort of lies on top of the orbits. Which is the orbits are for the eyes, right? So you can see how it actually if it's the orbits, it's also called the orbitofrontal cortex. I just lost my vision here, and I just want to check once again, is everything good? Can somebody just in the chat box says, yes, you can hear and see me. Thank you very, very much. Excellent. Okay. It also gives us maybe 2 seconds for a bit of a brain break, if you may. Excellent. Okay. So what you can see here is the so-called orbitofrontal cortex, the OFC. I'm mentioning this because I'm going to talk about this part of the brain. It's very much affected when it comes to addictions. Remember that this part of the brain is also a top-down processor. It means that this part of the brain is the part that assesses risk, and if the risk is too high, it will inhibit the action and the decision to make the decisions, and it will reduce risk-taking activity. Also, of course, being very much immature still in teenage brains. Therefore, teenagers are so susceptible to addictions. They have to use this immature top-down processor to actually demonstrate a certain appropriate type of risk behavior, being safe within the peer group, and then as they are safe within the peer group, from that safety, explore the world at an accelerated pace and learn from it and build knowledge at an accelerated pace. You can even argue, if you're at university with your immature frontal lobe risk processor, you are willing to study yourself into bits and pieces. I'm not sure that I actually want to do that again. But of course, that's a time to build knowledge, to explore the world, and then as you get older, a mature process, this processor, this part of the brain becomes very much into play, and it starts to ensure that you assess risk properly, and then ensures that I can actually have appropriate goal-directed behavior. Very important for the collective or the creative collective, if you may, in the world. Now, what I want to alert you to as I go to the next slide is that there are more structures in the internally inside of the brain. And so you can see these C-shaped structures. Remember, they are the limbic system. They all border the brainstem, therefore called limbus. And you see that little pink eye of the monster, the amygdala, the almond, and you see the hippocampus there, right? So this is the bag of peas. This is for memory formation, and this one also for memory formation, certain types of memory, but very much the seat of emotion, especially emotional memory, but very much geared to ensure that we are emotionally responsive. It means that we need to respond to every single threat much more than to rewards that come in our way, come our way, and we actually have to respond appropriately through the amygdalas to avoid those threats and to overcome them, and to maximize the rewards. This is the seat of emotion, and it plays an important role during addiction, and I'll get back to that. So you see the hypothalamus there, very important role in addiction, especially in the dark side of addiction. I'll get back to that as well. And the hippocampus, being part of the memory system, also has a role to play. And all of these areas are richly connected with this part of the brain, which is so important in the reward, in the process of actually enjoying reward for what I have achieved. I hope everybody is still with me. Let's continue. We have about 25 minutes to go through a very interesting piece of machinery. Now you see the hypothalamus there. We've already remember that the hypothalamus is the eye turned inward. It is part of the brainstem, part of the limbic system. It works through rhythms and cycles. Important, what the hypothalamus does is it is responsible for the stress response, for the chronic stress response. So the chronic stress response means that the hypothalamus activates the adrenal glands to secrete cortisol. So you have a whole stress response, a chronic stress response in the body as a result of the hypothalamus activating this. And the hypothalamus, together with the amygdalas, there you see them, the eyes of the monster, are all richly interconnected. And so what happens in the amygdala and what happens in the hypothalamus are all well known to each other. and the same with the memory system. So every single thing affects everything. Remember, we talked about this, right? So many times. Everything affects everything. We'll see again that everything affects everything in the brain-body system when it comes to performance. And as a coach, a high-performance coach, you have to be very almost at peace and comfortable with this idea that it's all about the gestalt. It's about the whole. It's about, there's so many things that affect everything, and we have little angles that levers we pull, but if I pull a lever here, it affects other levers, etc., etc. And I just want to know which lever is the best one to pull now, which will affect everything. Quite a fascinating concept when you think about this living system. The next structure I want to remind you about is these pathways between the amygdalas and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or the orbitofrontal cortex, which is the larger construct around this area as well. They are richly connected. This is the top-down processor. It is also very important. There's always a top-down and a down-up. It always connects with each other, and there's a crosstalk continuously. So these pathways are richly and highly important when it comes to addiction. This pathway, remember this one, this is the problem-solving part. This is the problem-solving machine, and you see this superhighway in the brain, which connects all these long-term memory sites, areas and knowledge constructs together with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex for problem-solving. So this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex bring in this, but all these components, all the knowledge building blocks, and construct a realistic scenario of the possible. This is also the area for executive function, and you will remember from the model, which I will show later as well, that executive function works in this prefrontal cortex. Executive function is also affected by addiction, and this is why I'm going to show you this. So every single component here that I've shown you is affected by addiction in some way or another. And it sort of sets us up to get to that. The amygdalas in control here, this is when the amygdalas are highly under chronic stress and in stress, and then the amygdalas lead to all kinds of havoc, if you may. In addiction, the amygdalas in control do two things. They stimulate through the hypothalamus a chronic stress response, but also in themselves, they lead to negative emotional states. And I'll get to that. And it's all in the amygdalas, and you can see that this is the areas where we actually want to have under the control of this prefrontal cortex. And this is what we want, which is absolutely what is not happening during addiction. Of course, in chronic stress, it also doesn't happen, but during addiction, you'll see that there are very particular components that are actually not working. And it leads to compulsive habituation and actually the continuous ingrainment and sustainment, if you may, of addictions. So where is this reward system and pathway? So we are sort of ready now to go into another structure. You've seen this in the goal-directedness videos in the course, but let me remind you, this is the pathway that we are talking about. This is the reward pathway. It starts in this area, which is called the mesolimbic area. Mesolimbic means in the medial midbrain area, right into the limbic system. Don't even worry about this. It's just a pathway that actually starts here in the so-called VTA, or the ventral tegmental area. This area, this is less important, but it's just worthwhile to understand that there's a pathway that consists of neural a neural pathway consisting of neurons that are connected with this area called the nucleus accumbens. Can you see that this is actually, these are neurons that are connecting, and they secrete a specific neurotransmitter. Remember, this is what we've been talking about so many times. So the transmitters that are secreted here are dopamine. And so dopamine is transmitted by these pathways. It also responds to this part of the prefrontal cortex. You see, this orbitofrontal. Can you see there it is. And so it is the part that is richly connected with this whole reward pathway. It is a wonderful structure, and it is in its constructive form. It enables us to assign energy to tasks, to overcome challenges, and to actually achieve higher and higher awards, higher and higher goals, if you may. And it's richly rewarding, very constructive. What happens during addiction with this pathway? Because this is where everything goes wrong. I'll show you another picture. There you see it again. There it is. This is a bit more at, I thought I'd start with the less complicated one, and then I'm just going to show you where it is. So there it is. It goes right into the prefrontal cortex, and you can actually see there's an area there where this area where you have the nucleus accumbens, but you also have other structures here that you can see. Can you see there's the hypothalamus, there's the pituitary gland, the P, and there's the hippocampus, and that's the amygdala. So you can actually see all those structures that we've been looking at are all actually in there. Fascinating, right? They're all there. And so we've got a few others here that I'm not going to talk to now, but you can actually see that it's all richly connected. Every single one of these areas that we've been talking about that actually do the good things for us are playing their part when it comes to the dopaminergic pathways in the central nervous system to actually give us reward. This pathway here is not involved in the reward system so much. It's the one that actually ensures that we have good motor function. And if you have a lack of dopamine and Parkinson's disease, then this area is affected, which comes from the so-called substantia nigra. This is actually not what we're not looking at this now. You can see that's the nigrostriatal pathway. We are talking about this pathway, the reward pathway. I hope everybody's still with me. Right, so remember it's physical. So in this particular pathway, this would be dopamine being secreted and binding on these yellow receptors. Now, these yellow receptors can be can vary from each other. You can have two, and you actually basically have two major different types of receptors in this area. The one is the dopamine 1 receptor, the D1, and the other one is the D2 receptor. Quite easy, right? So there's a D1 and a D2 receptor. Just hold that for a second. So in this reward pathway, you have two potential receptors on which your dopamine can bind. And under normal circumstances, something wonderfully happens. Under normal circumstances, just by the way, one step back. One of the so-called, if you think about the dopamine, and I'll show you this in a second. One of the receptors, the D2 receptor, is actually very much more. In fact, one of them, I'm going to be sure about. Yes, it is the D2 receptor. Is 10 to 100 times more sensitive to dopamine. So when you and I, under normal circumstances, have got a reward by eating, by thinking about things, by overcoming a challenge, by just continuously doing our things every day, we have the most sensitive one is continuously stimulated. But the one which is less reactive is quiet. It's when you have a big rush, for example, like a substance that you use, a very big rush. Or, for example, in sexual activity, during an orgasm, for example, or gambling when somebody really hit the jackpot, or they anticipate it even. That's when this other part, which is way less sensitive, is affected, is actually stimulated. And during addiction, if you continue to do this and overuse this system, there's an imbalance that actually starts to take place between these two receptors, an imbalance. These two receptors lead to different parts of the brain. They work through pathways into these different parts of the brain. The amygdala, the hypothalamus, the forebrain, this orbitofrontal cortex. They all do different things, and they do good things for us. The moment there's an imbalance because of the addiction, it starts to create havoc in these systems. And I'm going to actually show you what happens. By the way, just so here you see a synapse, you see. Please don't pay attention to the detail, but just to show you, hey, so there's a synapse, there's some dopamine that's secreted, see, DA, and it's secreted there, and then it binds on, this one is a D2 receptor, you see. So it binds on the number 2 receptor, dopamine number 2, which is, of course, way more sensitive. So it will continuously bind on this one. Okay, so that's under normal conditions. Once again, you can see another little picture. There's a dopamine secreted. It's in this cleft. It binds on the dopamine receptor, and this is usually D2. It will bind on D1, as we said, when you have a very, very big rush stimulus, and the hyperactivity then leads to D2 receptors. And then, of course, you start to actually have upregulation in more of certain receptors and downregulation of others. And it's downregulation and upregulation just refer to the imbalance that starts to take place. And so let me just repeat what I just said. You have a D1 and a D2 receptor in this pathway. The one is much more sensitive, so it responds. D1 only when you have a rush. And now in time, because when an addiction is continuously fed and it becomes an addiction, you have an imbalance. What does it affect? It affects all these structures that we've been talking about. We talked about the amygdala. We talked about this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Remember that turquoise part of the brain? The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is the part that you solve problems with. It's your executive function. The hypothalamus. They're all affected. And what happens is that through different areas, and let me just quickly say this, interesting enough, if you have a problem in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex because of the imbalance, you become more impulsive. If you have a problem in the amygdalas because of the continuous effect, it becomes what we call stress. This is the dark side of addiction. You develop emotional negativity, which also lead to more impulsivity. You have chronic stress due to the hypothalamus, which continues to lead to isolation, less capacity for problem solving, reduced capacity for resilience, as you know, all of that. And so you can actually just see that a number of little examples here of what happens explains this deeply, deeply destructive chain of addictions. And so let me remind you, there's the hypothalamus, and we said that's chronic stress. There's the amygdalas, the effect of emotional negativity in response to the system. And of course, they're all connected. This area, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, together with the orbitofrontal cortex, all affected, leading to more and more impulsivity and actually, and also continue to just have goal-seeking behavior for the drug and less dopamine available for any other goal achievement. So it reduces goal-seeking behavior or the goal directedness, but goal-seeking behavior is only to actually feed the addiction. And this part of the prefrontal cortex, the executive function is reduced. It's a massive problem. So you can actually see that even the executive function, the capacity for decision-making is reduced. So what do we have? We have somebody with reduced decision-making capacity, reduced problem-solving capacity, increased impulsivity and compulsive behavior, with continuous goal seeking to feed the addiction, reduced goal directedness, less energy available to assign to tasks to achieve. And then there's a negative emotional component that continues negative emotionality, which can lead to all to different psychiatric dysfunctions. And you have chronic stress. It is almost a full house that you see with addictions. And it's because of this imbalance between the two dopamine receptors, because of the abuse. And for me, abuse, when I think of abuse of this incredible reward system that's being abused. And therefore you have this imbalance between the receptor systems. And that's why you see what you see. So this is probably a good time to just look into this model of brain performance then, because we've sort of gone a little bit into the idea of the molecular, of the pathways, and of what addictions do. Let's bring it to life a bit when we think about the Neurozone model. You'll probably see when we talked about this, what is affected by addictions. It starts with goal directedness. And you know that in there we also talk about addictions, of course, because we know it's a massive negative, as a negative effect, together with destructive behaviors, on the energy that is assigned to tasks, simply because we say of this downregulation, you simply have so much less of a goal-directed behavior. At the same time, because everything affects everything, within goal-directedness, everything else is also affected. And I'm going to just talk you through that in a second, having a look at all our data that we have been looking at in the code, which is also quite fascinating. But social safety also affected. The sense of belonging, social isolation takes place. People become disconnected. You are isolated because of this compulsive behavior, low goal-directed behavior, and negative emotions lead to social isolation. Can you see? And social isolation then feed the addiction. think about this for a moment. If you think about what's happening in the world globally, in our external context at the moment. And so if you continue along the pathway, everything is effectively affected. I haven't gone time to go through everything, but there's executive function in the problem-solving machine, also reduced decision-making, reduced problem-solving capacity. So you can see that the model, there's a number of components in the model that is affected. This is a slide that we often use to talk about goal-directed behavior. You can see that goal-directed behavior, it talks about the energy that is assigned is very much like a spring here that is just strong. The stronger the spring, the better the energy that is assignable to a task. And so a healthy mood state and self-worth plays a very important role together with purpose in life to actually align us for achieving higher and higher goals. I don't have time to go into every one of these, but bear this in mind if you think about coaching, because you actually, when you rightfully so receive a patient, an ex-patient who has now become a client again. And bear in mind, if that client needs to be a patient, that person needs to be referred for treatment at that level. And so, but when you receive the ex-patient now has become the client again, these are areas that you really want to work on, because you actually want to work on this goal-directed state. And get the springy coils more springy. You want to work on the components that we've explained so many times also in the report. Reduce negative intrusive thought patterns, work on the idea of optimism, of humor, of enthusiasm, of curiosity and gratitude, because these are all actually enhance the springiness of the coil. And this then leads to confidence and motivation to actually start to achieve higher and higher goals. And this process continues to grow and develop in time. This is just, the reason I'm showing you this is that there are so many components here that are actually affected. Let me therefore just talk to you about the code. So we had 1,300. I asked the code people in their white coats in the back office, please analyze a set number of random individuals on our system, and I think they took about 1,300 individuals on the system at the moment. And of course, we don't have their names, but we do have aggregated data capabilities. So all the data capabilities put together gave us a very interesting finding. As far as these, and the closest item or behavior that we could have in our system is destructive habits. And destructive habits speak to an habituation that is destructive for me in my mind, and therefore is the closest that we could find that resembles addiction. It is not addiction. Addiction is very different. If you really want to study properly the effect of addiction, you have to actually study people in a rehabilitation center, for example, when they come in versus when they go out, and see what kind of correlations are with you can find in the code with the addiction itself. Of course, we haven't done that yet, and if I say yet, that is probably not part of our focus at the moment. We are working with functionality, and so what we did actually study is say, let's see what destructive habits, how they correlate. And so you can see here, significant yet small correlations with exercise and sleep-wake cycle drivers. Now, it's actually quite important to understand that exercise is a wonderful thing, and for so many things. The correlations between exercise and destructive habits is negative and positive. So our destructive habits reduce exercise. At the same time, if you exercise more, your destructive habits should go down. And this is because one of those, you remember the imbalance between the dopamine 1 and dopamine 2 drivers, receptors. Exercise starts to improve that imbalance. And this explains why it starts to actually reduce destructive habits. If the addiction is too ingrained, exercise is not going to do it. Well, number one is you're not going to get to exercising if you are so deeply addicted, because the goal-directed system is so shot, if I may use that slang word. So this is an interesting effect. We would probably expect that sleep-wake cycle is also affected, and smaller number of significant correlations with the nutrition, and none with science in mind, which I find very interesting. And I actually think that with addictions, we will see that it's got a very strong correlation. But this is what we found, right? So we report to you what we saw. Destructive habits and higher order drivers. A small significant correlation between destructive habits and learning related to job, learning techniques, and involuntary daydreaming. And then when it comes to other outcomes, the outcomes, it is destructive habits, job performance, self-leadership, and resilience. That makes sense. So our outcomes of our performance, the achieving of higher goals is reduced, self-leadership is reduced, and resilience is impacted negatively by destructive habits. And then when it comes to the emotional drivers, there's quite a bit there. So I just want to actually show this for a second. There's a significant, small to medium, correlation with all social safety drivers, especially belonging and meaning in personal life. See, that whole social safety driver is affected, and especially the sense of belonging and my meaning in my personal life. And then my personal social safety is largely affected by destructive habits. And then there's also a significant correlation between and the large actually one between destructive habits and negative thought patterns. Now, doesn't that make sense? We talked about the negative thought patterns of the amygdala that is affected by the imbalance between the dopamine 1 and dopamine 2 receptors. If we accept that these destructive habits also actually in themselves harbor a number of individuals who have got addictions, this makes a lot of sense. And so also then smaller correlations between destructive habits and enthusiasm, gratitude, and optimism. And of course, where the one is up, the other one is down. So there's a negative correlation, an inverted causative effect, right? So it's not that if you have destructive habits that your optimism will go up. Of course, you understand what I'm trying to explain here in a short amount of time. And lastly, we also looked at the competitive collaboration, fear, greed, and empathy. Those are also correlated with destructive habits. So everything affects everything. The question is, would some of these, if they are reduced, actually push us over into addiction if we have certain susceptibility for that? It's possible, right? We just don't know that from the study of the code. And so this is what I have time for, and I think we have 2 minutes left on the clock. I hope that you enjoyed a little bit of insight into the neuroscience of addictions. It's an incredibly complex field, but at least I think what is useful to understand is that everything affects everything. We have got a better understanding of what happens because of these addictions in the goal-directed pathway, which is supposed to be constructive for us, and also what are the things we really need to work on with our clients once they become ex-patients, meaning that they are ready now to be reintegrated into functionality and high performance. Probably pay attention to these different components, if you may, of or items that make up the construct of goal-directedness in the model. Are there any questions or thoughts at the moment? And I'm happy to stay around a bit for a few questions and thoughts. I think I see questions in the let me just stop sharing for a second. This is the first thing I'm going to do so we can see each other a bit better. So I'm just stopping sharing. There we are. And let me now see if I can read the questions. I'm going into the chat box to read questions. It's asked, you've been asked to please post your questions in the Q&A. So please, sorry, Neurozone, will you please post your questions in the Q&A section? I see there are 4 questions there, and I'm just going to quickly go through the Q&A first, and then I'll see if there's anything left in the chat box. Okay. How similar is addiction to substances to addiction to things like gambling, sex? Okay, that's an excellent question, and I hope that I've answered that question. It all is the same thing, if you may. The substance is the stimulus, provides the stimulus, which leads to the imbalance in the system. So what happens in the brain, as far as we understand, and we might find that there are differences in the future, but currently our understanding, grossly if you may, is that the same things happen in the brain when it comes to substances, when it comes to any cue that leads to a what we say, to a harmful effect as opposed to a constructive effect. Because remember that any cue that comes in that it leads to a dopamine secretion needs to provide us with a constructive result. it shouldn't be harmful. And the harmful effect of these substances and the cues that are coming in lead to the same problems in the brain in those different structures: the amygdala, the hypothalamus, this orbitofrontal cortex, and what did I leave out? I think I've mentioned them all. Also other areas that are affected, but I think those were the big ones. Okay, so I hope that explains the question. Can you repeat the distinction between chronic stress versus addiction? Okay, clear. So so chronic stress, remember, is it's a very distinct process in the brain-body system. It is a result of the hypothalamus really activating the so-called HPA axis. And remember, the HPA axis just stands for hypothalamus, pituitary gland, the punch bag, right? And the adrenal, HPA, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. That axis leads to the secretion of cortisol and other metabolites and other hormones, including noradrenaline, that are really important for us in a stress response to fight or run away. And as you know, in chronic stress, it is a lower response effect, and these metabolites become toxic over time. Chronic stress is a result of the hypothalamus being activated by the imbalance of an addiction. So chronic stress is a result of continuous of addiction over time. Prolonged chronic addiction leads to chronic stress. Chronic stress could also lead to addiction, but it doesn't necessarily do that, right? So I think that's the understanding. And addiction itself, of course, one of the results in the so-called dark side of addiction, when the amygdala and the hypothalamus is affected, it's actually affected by something called corticotropin release factor, CRF. It's actually a substance that is secreted by the amygdalas and the hypothalamus, or actually in front of that, even to actually stimulate both of those to activate negative emotions, impulsivity eventually, and also chronic stress. I hope that makes sense. It is quite complicated. Getting lost in the technical graphs. All right. Of course, this is a masterclass, and I hope that that you grasp some of the components. I try to explain it as well as I can, but I also think that it's worthwhile. If you want to read further, you can probably also read about these aspects, and you can then say, "Oh, I've heard about that, and now I can make a link." All right. So my apologies if you don't understand absolutely everything, but I hope that you get the gist of it. And then please. Then I've often wondered when the profile indicates destructive habits, what those habits could be. Yes, that's a good question, and we actually haven't gone into that. We acknowledge that in the profile that we try to steer away from those things that make people set up and say, hey, I'm not going to share this with nobody because you know what, this is too personal and too private, and you can understand that it's too confidential, and so it is a challenge for us. It's a challenge to really know exactly what's gone wrong in that profile, and as a coach you might actually have a space of safety with your coachee, who can then share with you what it is that they want to work on. And I'm not sure exactly who of you have that kind of rapport with some of your clients, but I would assume that is the case. So my apologies to that question. And the next question, please comment on treatment or coaching process we need to follow in solving this issue. So very important to distinguish between the demarcation of treatment and therapy under the line of functionality. I think it's a very safe space to assume that, of course, as a coach, you will come across pathology. And you have to know at some point that, you know what, if this person has an addiction, it's always better to send this person to a therapist, meaning in the sort of under the line group, whether this is a psychologist or psychiatrist, somebody who can actually see an individual and make a proper diagnosis of what kind of addiction this is, where in this addiction down spiral this person finds themselves, before you start to coach somebody who you are not 100% sure is ready to be coached. And so and of course there are gray areas, and I actually absolutely accept that, but I think as a rule of thumb that's a good one. And then once you have as we said, an ex-patient or a patient who was actually not a patient or a non-patient who was a client, The coaching aspects, this is where I really want to mention the components which we understand that are really important from the study of the code, are these components that make up goal-directed behavior. You want to really ensure that the goal-directed behavior is enhanced. And it always happens within the ecosystem of social safety. So you really want to look at the social safety, sense of making a meaningful contribution, sense of belonging. You establish social safety, number one, because if you don't do that, you actually are, I think, and my understanding of social safety being such a negative effect through the chronic stress response on an individual that you probably have a problem achieving what you need to achieve. That's number one. Then I'm going to list these just purpose in life, which means living life purposefully. Life is bigger than me. There's a purpose and meaning to what I'm doing. Optimism and belief that what I do is valuable and important. Really a useful next one. Second, then the third one is self-worth, which says I'm actioning my values. And the values I have in life is interpersonal values that are important to me, and my intrapersonal. This is the internal values, and then interpersonal values. How do I relate to people around me? What is fair and moral and so forth? And am I actually doing that? So that's, if you think about those components, addictions, for example, just on the dot reduces self-worth. And so that's, and then of course, then you get into the space of working with, and then serotonin, a healthy mood state, exercise. Please, everybody, just pay attention to exercise. And of course, the foundational drivers all contribute to that healthy mood state. And then it is the positive intrusive processes of characteristics of optimism. I'm repeating them again: optimism, enthusiasm, add some humor, and gratitude. Gratitude training is so important. And then, of course, curiosity, starting to enhance the executive function system and the abstraction with that again. I hope this helps a bit. And I think those were the answers to those questions are about helping them to, I see there's many other questions we actually can't get to. How do we know when a healthy thing like exercise becomes unhealthy and addiction? Good question. You know what I often say is that in a healthy society, and I'm just going to share this with you, and because I don't have a scientific answer to that, but maybe just a common sense thought, when the means to an end becomes the end itself, it's a problem. And so if you think about exercise and people all just running and exercise, they live to exercise and do the mountain biking and the running and the jogging and the whole city life, modern life. If that becomes the end, it's a problem. It has to be a means to an end to set you up for high performance, to achieve what purpose in life actually speaks to. Living life purposefully and making a meaningful contribution. That's what I can say to that. Can addiction to social media fall into this category? We don't know enough about social media. I was so afraid of this question because it is such a difficult one. The answer is social media addiction, a so-called digital addiction, is an encompassing term with a scale that is well validated to say, if you have these and these and these, you have social digital addiction. But there are many different subcategories with different types of damaging effects. And yes, some of them can have this effect on the brain, undoubtedly, as an overstimulus. Others just overstimuli that causes certain brain changes, as opposed to exactly what we're seeing here. And so I think personally that digital addictions still have to be very much categorized, and we need to understand it better. And managing screen time for kids, yes, absolutely. Overstimulus, and of course, the problem with screen time for kids is that they lose on the other beneficial behaviors that you really want to build. What about heredity? What role does it play in addiction? Some people therefore almost set up to be addicted. Yes, up and down on this, many different opinions. Currently, we do believe, I mean, the scientific community is now back to this point where they say there is a certain hereditary predisposition for addiction, but it doesn't mean that people who don't have that predisposition will not become addicted. It just means that you are more susceptible to addiction and therefore have to be even more careful. And how that's been diagnosed is not clear to me. And then I think all the questions have been posted here. I think it is yes. Absolutely great. I really want to say thank you to all of you. thank you very much for staying a little bit longer, and have a wonderful day and evening. It was great to spend this hour and a bit with you. Goodbye.